Hi, my name is Rob Waddell. I'm in the history department here at the University of Rhode Island, and we're here today talking with folks that were involved in civil rights activities down in Mississippi and in the South in general. And so, in the interest of time and getting started, we'll let Mac introduce himself and then have some conversation around that. So, Mac, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Malcolm Farmer. I'm a 75-year-old lawyer from Providence, Rhode Island, who in 1965 quit my job at my law firm, went to Mississippi with the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, and represented the movement and local blacks as well as civil rights organizations for the next 2 years in Louisiana, based in Jackson, Mississippi, and Selma, Alabama.
So I guess we would start with a little bit of background info on where you came from and how you got to that point where you were going to be one of these volunteers. So could you tell me a little bit where you grew up, where you were from, and how that sort of led into where you ended up going down to the South.
I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island. I was very fortunate to be born into a wealthy family, which was very conservative, waspy, and definitely not interested in the civil rights movement. It's hard to really pin down exactly what motivated me to go there, but I know that in 1947, I was 7 years old, and Jackie Robinson broke into Major League Baseball, and I became a huge Dodger fan. Because then I felt that it was really unfair that because of black people couldn't play pro baseball. And later, as I went through Yale University and Harvard Law School, obviously I was very fortunate to receive an outstanding education. I became aware of constitutional issues and civil rights issues, but I still wasn't particularly involved in it. One day walking home from work, I graduated from Harvard Law School in 1964, went to work for the firm I'm with today in Providence. And I was walking home and I came across a picture from the New York Times of a small black boy who was at a demonstration for the Mississippi Freedom Democrat Party in Jackson, and there was a highway patrolman with a billy club that was trying to tear the flag away and hit the kid, and I got really pissed off about that. So I started asking around about civil rights activities, and I ended up volunteering at the Providence office of the Congress of Racial Equality, which is known as CORE, just advising people on their rights after work. And I got pretty fulfilled by that activity because I realized they really needed help and my advice was meaningful to them. So I kept asking around if there was any way that I could end up going south and helping people like that child, and ultimately was connected to Carl Racklin, who was general counsel for CORE, who told me about the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, known as LCDC, and that organization had a couple of staff lawyers in Jackson, but took volunteer lawyers from the north because the white Mississippi bar did not want to represent civil rights workers, but they did want to convict them of offenses, and there were only about 3 black lawyers in Mississippi. So there was a secret deal that they would allow lawyers from other states to come down and represent just civil rights organizations and activists so that they could convict them. And under that sort of deal, we were allowed to practice law in that limited way without being members of the Mississippi bar. So that, I ended up in the summer of '65 in Monroe, Louisiana, met James Farmer, head of CORE, who was no relation, and engaged in a lot of activities that were way beyond my level of experience as a lawyer and really fulfilling. And so I told LCDC if they could pay my living expenses, I'd quit my job and come down full time. And they could, and I did, at the end of the summer and the fall. And then I spent 2 years representing those organizations, and especially local blacks.
So was that, when you saw that photograph, was that your first time encountering the situation? Or had you followed it? Because by the time we get to 64, 65, this what historians are calling the classical phase of the civil rights movement, has we've already seen at that point, what's happened in Birmingham and Albany and with the Freedom Riders, and so had you followed or been involved, not as a participant, but in terms of being interested in some of those earlier events?
Well, I think I was aware by that time of the civil rights struggle and that was going on in the South, but it wasn't part of my life in any way, and I had not really been involved. I think around that time, John Chafee was governor of Rhode Island, and I was very close to him, and he was supporting fair housing legislation, and I got a little bit involved in that. But it was the stimulus of actually seeing the picture of what was being done to that little boy that just kind of was a tipping point. And I had always had it was really unfair to me that was being done to that child. And I think just the way it was unfair to prevent blacks from playing professional baseball. And so that unfairness was sort of an underlying motivation, and that picture just sort of crystallized it. And I didn't have any trouble at all making a decision that I wanted to go help people like that. But it goes back to the fairness. I was taught that way in school, and how you treated people and everything. So that background it was kind of like it was waiting for something to occur that would get me off my butt to go help out. I think. I was aware also that I was really lucky, and I owed something back just because of the way I was born.
So when you decided you were going to go down in 65, what was the reaction amongst your peers, your coworkers, your family? Was there concern? Was there sort of befuddlement? What was the reaction of some of those folks?
Well, my mother claimed that decision forced her onto Valium. My parents were very hostile about it. They thought I was destroying my legal career. They weren't supportive of the idea of the principles of the civil rights movement at all. The law firm was upset with me because although I was only a year out of law school, they regarded me as a promising young litigator. But my law firm was the one who allowed me to volunteer for a month in the summer of 65 as well. So the leadership of that firm was very sort of mission-oriented and committed to improving the community and their obligations to the community. So they allowed me to do that, and then they were kind of upset when I went full-time and was no longer going to be there. I didn't have any friends who were involved in the movement, and while Mike Van Leesten, who is the other person who made a major commitment to going south to the civil rights movement from Rhode Island, will be interviewed as part of this project. I really got to know him later, and so I was kind of on my own.
So what month was it that you went down in 65?
I went down in July of 65 to Monroe, Louisiana.
And was that the first time you'd been anywhere down in the Deep South?
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about I guess how you got down there, and then what your initial experience was when you I don't know if you flew down or if you took a bus or drove down, but what it was when you first arrived.
When I first arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, driving a 64 green Mustang, I asked a cop for directions to 603 North Farish Street, which was the LCDC office in Jackson, and I had Rhode Island plates on the car, and he told me there's no way he was going to help me get there, and I shouldn't be there, and furthermore I ought to be back home and stop bothering them. So I had to ask a lot of people to even find the office. The first significant experience I had occurred the next morning, and that was because when I got to the office, Al Bronstein, who was the chief counsel, said, "We need you to go to Philadelphia, Mississippi in the morning and represent a Corps worker who's been charged with carrying a concealed weapon." Philadelphia, Mississippi was where Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner had been assassinated in '64, as it turned out, by the deputy sheriff, Cecil Price, Klansman, and Lawrence Rainey, the sheriff. And I was aware of that, so it was likely that it was going to be a dangerous experience. So I looked up the concealed weapons statute. It only covered sawed-off shotguns, and I got a tape measure because I was so smart because I'd gone to Harvard Law School. And although I'd never tried a case anywhere. And in Mississippi then, you didn't have to have a high school degree to be a justice of the peace. So Cecil Price was the prosecuting officer, and the trial was in, the justice of the peace was a garage mechanic, and the trial was in his automobile garage. So Price, the so-called concealed weapon, which had been in the back window of this young lady's car, where everybody had guns in Mississippi, was a shotgun, and Price identified the shotgun. I gave him the tape measure, asked him to measure the barrel, and he did, and it was much longer than the barrels covered by the statute. So I said to the Justice of the Peace, "So, Your Honor, I move the charges be dismissed, since clearly this shotgun is not covered by the statute." Price just took the shotgun and pointed it right at the side of my head and said, "Boy, either she's guilty or you're dead." And the guy says, "Guilty as charged." We fined her. And then we got her out of this. So that was actually the first trial I ever had in my legal career. So much for Harvard Law School.
And at that point, did you try to get out of there as quickly as possible?
Well, I had to take care of my client and make sure she was going to have to go home to the north, because she couldn't stay there any longer after this had happened. And then one of the local lawyers wanted to see me, and so I saw him, and he basically pointed out that, you know, if I wanted to come down there and destroy their way of life, that was up to me, but I had to realize that someone like him could have me killed just by picking up the phone. And I left his office and then drove back to Jackson. That was a message that they tended to send to a lot of us often, just a threat, you know. But I wasn't killed, so it was okay.
So you went back to Jackson, and then where did you go from there? The way we operated in Mississippi was to have a central office in Jackson, and then as local civil rights organizations, particularly the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and CORE, had issues or needed advice or people were arrested, then we would basically by automobile travel all over the state to represent those people. Sometimes we'd stay in the homes of local black activists, but we had a central office from which we could, you know, because our staff was so small, there were only 3 lawyers full-time and 1 secretary. Everybody else who came through was a volunteer who'd come for like 2 or 3 weeks, and it was, we handled a huge caseload, but I was a 25-year-old lawyer 1 year out of law school, so I ended up trying criminal defense cases, affirmative actions to desegregate schools, enjoin police brutality. We formed co-ops, we formed manufacturing companies that were non-community organizations. In the latter part of the time I was there, there were just a host of legal matters that we handled all over the state, and a bit in Selma, Alabama, and most of the people we represented were local blacks who were part of the movement and were the ones who were experiencing most extreme deprivation, violence, loss of jobs, loss of life, property, and we were aware that, you know, I knew that I could leave at any time, but they couldn't, and they were the ones who showed the most extraordinary capacity to encourage, to try to achieve just the right to vote was such a huge thing for them, but to try to end the system of racial segregation. And so we tended to try to remain sort of in the background and not have the focus on us. So, you know, when I got arrested,
it was really uncomfortable because it wasn't supposed to be about me. It was supposed to be about them. And in the background, we would help advise them on certain things. And so we went to a lot of demonstrations just so we were there to observe and see people's rights being, taken away from them. Then we advise people what to do or bail them out of jail and that kind of thing.
Did you win any cases?
Yeah, we won a lot of cases because in the state criminal charges, we won a lot of cases because we could remove them to federal court if a federal right was being violated. And in the federal courts, one of the two federal district court judges in Mississippi was a moderate, the other was a racist. Frank Johnson in Alabama was definitely a moderate. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where we ended up appealing cases in New Orleans, was progressive. And they handed down a host of, from our point of view, positive civil rights decisions, even though they were all Southerners, basically all from the Deep South. But they were an extraordinary bulwark against injustice for us. We didn't do so well in the lower state courts. The trials were just a pantomime of cases, but we knew that, and we knew we'd have to appeal, and we knew, and so a lot of the fundraising that had to be done was raising bail money, because we had to constantly try to get young people out of jail, and particularly local blacks who had no resources to take care of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in some of my own work, I encountered any number of people who, when they would be arrested, they would either have an attorney who didn't file a bond motion on their behalf, or for other reasons had to remain. So necessary stuff to raise money to get them out. But so you were doing a whole combination of just. I'm fascinated by the idea that you were doing not just criminal work, and not just this idea that you were going to come down and help them convict a few folks, but you ended up in some constitutional kind of litigation and things like that. Was that the plan all along, or was that just sort of where things took you when you?
No, the plan all along for what we as lawyers was doing was to provide representation and try to establish protection for and recognition of constitutional rights in a completely corrupt system of justice. So it's sort of hard to imagine today, but the entire system of justice was corrupted by the fact that its primary goal was to maintain racial segregation, not to deliver justice to people. So the quality of justice that whites got in white against white issues wasn't good at all. The educational system was functioning largely to perpetuate racial segregation. So in those days, as I remember, white Mississippians scored the lowest in the country on the selective service system draft board IQ exams. The quality of education they were getting was terrible as well. Never mind the fact what was being done to blacks. So all of the even federal programs of assistance, like crop allotments, or the administration of the selective service system was discriminatory. Your entitlement to welfare assistance or social security benefits, blacks are being deprived of it all the time. Sharecroppers thrown off plantations if they registered to vote. So everywhere you looked, there's this gigantic institutional structure of racial segregation, but it was corrupting the entire system of governance and life in this state. And the effects of that corruption went deeply into life in Mississippi. And so I was always thinking that we were doing them a favor. They should have been applauding us and not trying to beat the crap out of us and stuff, because we ended up, and the movement ended up, defeating that state-sponsored, government-sponsored system of racial segregation. In the end, they couldn't survive. And Dr. King's theory of nonviolence was the only way it could be done, but that nonviolent system, which triggered violent reactions, caused the rest of America to see how evil the system was and to support it and create momentum for the federal 64 and 65, Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, and financial support to keep the movement going. So it built on itself. So in a way, when you sit back and look at it, Dr. King was a genius for the way that he oversaw and promoted the civil rights movement, which became an effort to try to attract media attention, which attracted financial support, which attracted governmental support, political correctness, and momentum behind the idea that the South was isolated in terms of government-sponsored and run racial segregation. So that ended, and then people are always asking us, well, now that Obama's president, do we have a post-racial society? And the answer to that is clearly so no, and we're not even close, because the concept of whiteness is still dominates, standing and delivery of services and people's rights and experiences in the criminal justice system. So the overall strategy behind what the lawyers were doing was to change a legal system of injustice. And that could only be done if we could go into court representing people who were challenging it to gain their constitutional rights, and ultimately accumulate decisions which force those constitutional recognition of constitutional rights down the system of justice's throat. And what happened towards the end was we ended up actually with white Mississippi lawyers consulting with us on constitutional issues for their clients, white clients, who also were experiencing some loss of civil rights. And what you could see between 64 and let's say 67, the latter part of the time that I was there, we were spending much more time on economic development for community organizations, trying to get health care for people, trying to get the federal government as well as the state government to administer all their programs on some racially non-discriminatory way. And essentially that's what the society changed gradually over that time, but it became, they were not going to have economic development or national companies moving to Mississippi until they cleaned this up, because nobody wanted the turmoil of local blacks picketing their businesses and making them look like racists. It didn't work, and ultimately it sunk in. So today there are a lot of black legislators in the state of Mississippi and Alabama, but racism is still rampant. It's just not promoted by the government.
Was that experience to you, was that in any way sort of a shock to your system? And coming out of Harvard Law School, did you have a deeper sort of faith in the idea of justice in the American system that was shaken at all by your experience?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a life-changing experience. I was never the same after, and it didn't take long in Jackson when you saw what was happening to realize really what was at stake and how disgusting this system was. And so I never went back to being sort of oblivious to how bad it could be, because given the way I'd been brought up and where I'd been brought up, I was unaware of it. I mean, the only black people I knew growing up were our butler and his wife, our cook. And because my father was away in the war, he's the one that taught me how to play football and baseball and everything. And that was it. There were none in the high school I went to, a couple at Yale. So I was confronted with something that was a complete challenge to sort of the assumptions that we took for granted for how courts worked. And yes, you knew that there were cases overturning Brown v. the Board of Education, but it didn't really sink in as to what that meant on a day-to-day basis to a child who was in that segregated school who was black. And that had an overwhelming impact. But you also saw how damaging the effect of corruption could be when a governmental institution is motivated by something other than the mission it should have in terms of providing for the community it represents and being fair and administering justice fairly and actually educating people. And so there's no way that I think people who went down there and got involved in the movement didn't come away with really significant life-changing experiences that lasted. Mm-hmm. It certainly did for me.
Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you a little bit about that in just a moment. One one quick other thing and there's a whole lot we could continue to talk about if we had all the time in the world. But the years you were working in the South, you were there from 65 to 67.
Correct.
Am I right? And it was in 65 that you were was it in the fall of 65 that you started full time being
Yes.
down there? Were there was there a cadre of local people that were sort of your entree into the local communities where you were living? I guess what I'm really asking is sort of what was your connection to some of the folks that were living in those communities, and did you feel like you had been sort of brought in and were part of those communities, or did you still feel sort of like an outsider that was sort of traveling around and doing sort of scattershot here and there?
Well, during 1965 in particular, and into 1966, the services we performed around the state of Mississippi drew us very close to our clients who were local blacks. And to some extent, we did drive into a community where there was a crisis and help people deal with that crisis. And we got close to the families of people we were actually representing. I mean, one of the things that happened and that I did several times was a white woman would claim that she'd been raped by a black man, and she'd identify someone in a lineup. And they would appoint a white lawyer, and he would say, either you plead guilty and you'll go to the state cotton penitentiary, the Parchman, the cotton plantation the state ran, for life, or you'll be found guilty and you'll be lynched. And so he'd plead guilty. So their families would write us and ask if we could do anything, and I'd go to Parchman, interview, and we'd get the conviction reversed because there were no blacks in the voting list and therefore no blacks on the grand jury that indicted him. And then that was up to the district attorney to recharge him. Not one of the people that we represented in those circumstances was ever recharged because no one was raped. It was a totally kind of sick psychological way to get attention. And so those families, in those kinds of instances, we would obviously get very close to the family and spend time with them because we needed to help them and our client with his life and how this whole experience was going to affect them. As time passed, in 1966, I was on the Meredith March, and I bailed Stokely Carmichael and a couple of other SNCC workers out of jail during that march. And that's actually the one time I met Dr. King was in Canton, Mississippi on that march, and they all got tear gassed. They tried to sleep in a school yard, and they got tear gassed by the local law enforcement. And there's a guy named Willie Ricks who was with SNCC, and he had used the term Black Power. That night, Stokely spoke and used it repeatedly in a very effective kind of spellbinding speech. And that began a process where there was more focus on Black Power, and we were clearly sort of lawyers for those people who were militantly in favor of, Black is beautiful and Black Power, excluded us to some extent from real closeness or being integrated, which was okay because as far as we were concerned, because as long as we were able to help them, that was our role. We didn't have to be part of the social set. So it did change during the period I was there towards the end. Also, in another way, we got more deeply involved with the community because as we shifted from just criminal defense of defending criminal charges against civil rights workers to more sort of economic development and government community organization, we got more involved in the community because of the nature of what we had to be in order to be effective. So it changed in different ways over the time that I was there.
Mm-hmm. So then you came back to Providence in 1967. Could you tell us a little bit about what you did in the years after you got back and how this experience informed where you went as an attorney and so on afterwards?
Well, I came back and ran the Crime Commission under the Safe Streets legislation, preventing law enforcement from getting federal money to buy half-track tanks and artillery to get through the summer in South Providence, which was a primarily black area and poor area of the city. So I had to oppose things like that, get them radios or something. And then I came back, that ended, I went back to practice law, ended up with a friend Mike Van Leesten being involved in representing Opportunities Industrialization Center of Rhode Island, which was a job training program in the black community. Stayed with that. There were a series of other similar nonprofit activities that I pursued, which led, because my family and I had always been involved in politics, I ran for the Providence City Council in 1978. I served 12 years on the council. I was a very left-wing Republican at that point. While I was on the council, kind of things I did that were still consistent with, based on my Mississippi experience, were to oppose redistricting, which would discriminate against black voters, promoted disinvestment of city funds in companies that did business in South Africa during apartheid. I introduced gay rights legislation in the early 80s, which in a heavily Catholic state resulted in complete turmoil, and the community just ruptured. People couldn't get out of Catholic churches without signing petitions against me and things. So the whole community, and ultimately it ended up failing on a tie vote, but then subsequently passed in the state legislature, which today passed, marriage equality. So that was the beginning of sort of the mobilization in Rhode Island of the gay community as a political force. And to me, it was kind of the same issue. There are clearly differences between being able to identify somebody visually and being able to identify someone's sexual orientation, but the discrimination that was going on was the same kind of discrimination against people because of their innate qualities and not because of the content of their character, to paraphrase Dr. King. So fighting for gay rights was just a natural outgrowth of the same thing. And then subsequently, when my wife, I helped, she was the first woman ever elected to a statewide office in Rhode Island. We were both involved in a series of social causes. Then when I got off the council, I continued on and am today like president of the board of the largest child and family welfare nonprofit in the state, and we run most of the system of care for abused and neglected children. There are constantly, politically, I've been involved in campaign after campaign, but they're now, particularly for Latino candidates who have come in and are experiencing discrimination again, and looking at the fear that people who are documented, who are Latino, have, and why they won't go seek social services because they're scared of being treated as undocumented. And you see the same issues continuing. It's not only in Providence and around the country, but around the world. And so, there's plenty to do once you get hooked on this kind of motivation. And for me, I always felt that my experience in Mississippi, I was far and away the primary beneficiary of the opportunity I had to go to Mississippi. It changed my outlook on life. It led to an extremely rewarding career in terms of helping other people, which just, some people are motivated by other things. That just happens to give me a big return, and I really was blessed to be able to do that.
So safe to say that this was, very much, your becoming involved was very much a sort of turning point in the trajectory of where you were going in your life and in your career. Well, I think we're out of time. Unfortunately, I'd love to sit and chat all day, and you and I can talk a little bit later. But is there anything before we stop that you'd like to share, or say that we didn't get a chance to talk about in the limited time we had?
No, I think the main thing is for students and young people today to realize that this is one of the dominant, serious, negative issues that our country faces. And they will be facing it as they grow up. So if there's one thing that you can really commit yourself to try to change, is change racism.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.